This is Diesel for We the People News. We're going to discuss a little bit about warrant, but I found, as usual, Kristen Hall. She's one of my favorites on the original intents of the Constitution. There's some other ones out there, but she really deeps in the history of it, even all the way back into England. But we need to learn more about the original intent of our warrant, what gives them proper cause and all this kind of stuff. And I don't have a whole lot of time to really just write down things and talk to you about it. Most of the time when I talk in a video, it's just last minute. And I had this put back onto the side and another channel for later on, where if I need to and when I want to use it, because I knew that my time frame would be short, and this happened to be one of them time frames. Now this is going to probably be a 3-part video because it really needs to be understood, because we've had under illusion that the Supreme Courts have all this power when it's only opinions and not rulings, and the government just takes it from the Supreme Courts and treat us as fools because we don't know what the original intent of the Constitution is. I'm going to go ahead and proceed forward. I'm not an attorney. These videos just learning lessons for us, and just a reminder for everybody out there, never look just straight forward. Always look around you, because the outside forces may try to cause you harm. So let's go ahead and proceed forward. And like I said, this is probably going to be a 3-part video.
Liberty over security, principle over party, truth over your favorite personality. And it seems lately we have been talking a lot about the Fourth Amendment, which just proves that history always repeats. The Fourth Amendment, although not called the Fourth Amendment, back in our founders' day, was a huge issue for them as well. Writs of assistance, warrantless searches. We didn't invent the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures. We inherited that. Our framers had that guaranteed protection of their liberty from over 500 years of liberty charters. So when George III began breaking down doors and searching and seizing without warrants, our framers didn't have to figure out what was going on. They knew, thanks to a brilliant, brave patriot by the name of James Otis Jr. James Otis Jr., by the way, is why we are independent from Great Britain today. That history belongs to one man. Even our framers gave him the credit for it, calling him the midwife of liberty. James Otis Jr., an attorney who had received the highest post that any attorney could receive, was now in charge of enforcing warrantless searches on the colonists. James Otis Jr. had been raised a patriot, however, and started feeling conflicted by the things that the government wanted him to do. He couldn't engage in these warrantless searches without having a conflict of his conscience. He had been taught about liberty from his father, also an attorney. He had been taught about the right of the people to not be engaged in, or not be submitted to warrantless searches. You see, James Otis Jr. decided one day that he could no longer do the job that the government had hired him to do. He could not engage in these warrantless searches of innocent people. He said, there is no way in good conscience I can do this. He called these warrantless searches the worst instruments of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty ever found in an English law book. the most destructive, the worst arbitrary power. And yet, James Otis Jr. had been paid to do this. This was his job, his commission by the king. He should have possibly just followed the orders of the king. He would not have been in trouble for following orders, now would he? Just doing his job? But Otis said no. Who could do this job in conscience? Who could do this job knowing that these people have done nothing wrong? Who could do this job? So James Otis Jr. resigned his post and said, no, I cannot do this job. James Otis Jr. not only resigned his post, but went about educating the people on what the government was actually doing. He became a whistleblower. We cannot allow this to happen. Not on our watch. James Otis Jr. would eventually pick up a legal case against the British government on these warrantless searches and seizures. This would be February of 1761. Did you catch that date? 1761. There was no committees of correspondence. There were no Sons of Liberty. There was no liberty movement at all in February of 1761. Just James Otis Jr. standing alone in the name of liberty, in the name of conscience. James Otis Jr. was outcast by his community. He was called just about every bad name in the book. He was not called a good Christian man. But James Otis Jr. continued in his education of the people, continued in his fight. The legal community told him, if you don't shut up, James, you will never practice law in the colonies again, anywhere in the kingdom. James Otis Jr. said, I have to keep going. They said, James, what are you doing? Why are you so upset about these searches? We're only searching people that are breaking the law. We're only searching people to enforce the law. What are you afraid of? Are you doing something wrong, James? Do you have something to hide? What is your problem with this? Only people who have something to hide would have something to fear.
Does that sound familiar?
What is your problem? Why are you afraid? Doing something wrong? Got something to hide? See, James Otis Jr. believed he had nothing to hide, but everything to preserve. He said, I can sincerely declare that I cheerfully submit myself to every odious name for conscience sake, and from my soul I despise all those whose guilt, malice, or folly has made them my foe. So it doesn't matter why you support this kind of tyranny, Otis was saying. Maybe you're guilty of violating people's liberties. Maybe you're those who are enforcing those warrantless searches. Maybe you are one of those who is gaining from those.
Sound familiar?
Maybe you benefit from striking fear into the hearts of people.
Sound familiar?
Or perhaps you just don't understand why this is wrong. And because of your ignorance, you think I'm doing something wrong. He says, I accept that for my conscience sake. And unfortunately, from my soul, I have learned to despise you. You have made yourself my foe. You see, those who do not respect liberty, those who do not understand liberty to its destruction, James Otis Jr. is an enemy to those who love liberty. That's why I'm always trying to show you that it really doesn't matter whether your politician is wicked and evil destroying liberty or just simply ignorant destroying liberty, because at the end of the day it makes no difference. Liberty is still destroyed through guilt, malice, or folly. And we should be enemies with people who are destroying our liberty. Those are strong words, right? Enemies, despise, soul. And that's how strongly we should feel about these things. And James Otis Jr. said, let consequences be what they will. I am determined to proceed. And in February of 1761, James Otis Jr. took up a legal case against the British government, against these warrantless searches that would change the world. February of 1761, James Otis Jr. would not win this case. As a matter of fact, the court wouldn't even give him the courtesy of a ruling. "We'll take it under advisement, Mr. Otis," they said, which kept the law intact. James Otis Jr. has been charged with treason. He can be shot on sight, and the court doesn't even do anything about a ruling. They change nothing. So James Otis Jr. has sacrificed his reputation and possibly even his life.
Sound familiar?
And his fortune. And the laws are still intact, and the searches still continue. So what did he actually do? I'll tell you what he did. You know, history is always our greatest teacher in hindsight, right? Can you imagine how defeated James Otis Jr. may have felt if he hadn't realized that he had just changed the world? John Adams would write about that day that James Otis Jr. changed the world, that day in the courtroom. He would write about it 40 years later. He said, "But Otis was a flame of fire. With a promptitude of classical allusions, a depth of research, a rapid summary of historical events and dates, a profusion of legal authorities, a prophetic glare of his eyes into the future, and a rapid torrent of impetuous eloquence, he hurried away all before him." John Adams said, "American independence was then and there born. The seeds of patriots and heroes to defend the vigorous youth were then and there sown. Every man of an immense crowded audience appeared to me to go away, as I did, ready to take up arms against these writs of assistance." Then and there, Adams said, was the first scene of the first act of opposition to the arbitrary claims of Great Britain. Then and there, the child of independence was born. Adams would conclude his thought by saying, and in 15 years, namely in 1776, that child grew up to manhood and declared himself free. Our founders would call James Otis Jr. the midwife to liberty, because on February of 1761, James Otis Jr. stood pretty much alone and birthed the spirit of liberty in the hearts of the men who would become our liberty. You see, in that packed-out audience that John Adams talked about was not only John Adams, but Dr. James Warren and Samuel Adams and the men who would become our liberty. All because of warrantless searches. Our founders did not invent the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but based upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the places to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. They didn't invent that, they inherited that. But through our ignorance, we have become the enemy of liberty because we no longer know the value of it. We no longer know the limits of government, and we have these writs of assistance being birthed again today. Time to rise and shine.
So this is going to end part 1. So that way you can kind of reflect on the history of our warrants and the one man that stood up against all odds. And we, the people, are letting our fathers and fathers down, that one man down, and one another down, by letting our king government take control of us once again. History is repeating itself. This is Diesel for We the People News. Take this and proceed forward on it. Bye, y'all.